Hi, this is Ed Fitzpatrick. If you enjoy local politics as much as I do, be sure to join our friends at Rhode Island PBS for the show A Lively Experiment. Hosted by Jim Hummel, the weekly series features journalists, pundits, and politicians debating the stories and issues that matter most to us Rhode Islanders. Tune in to A Lively Experiment and be part of the conversation. Fridays at 7 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS and wherever you get your podcasts. From the Boston Globe, this is Rhode Island Report. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. Welcome back to the podcast where we bring you big conversations from our very small state. Scientific researchers in Rhode Island are reeling from canceled grants and other potential cuts to federal funding for their work. Our very own Steph Machado just finished a story for Rhode Island PBS Weekly about the effects of these cuts. She's here to tell us more. Award-winning journalist Steph Machado, thank you for coming all the way down the hallway to talk with us today.
Thank you, award-winning host Ed Fitzpatrick.
So I watched your story on Rhode Island PBS Weekly. Can you describe what's happening to federal grants for scientific research here in Rhode Island?
Yes. Just like other states across the country, Rhode Island is seeing a number of scientific grants being cut by the federal government, everything from HIV research to mental health research, climate resiliency type research. And the cuts are mainly coming to Brown University and the University of Rhode Island. Those are the two biggest academic research institutions in the state. On top of that, there is a threatened cut of $500 million to Brown University that has not really been specified as to what exactly that's for. And the Trump administration has threatened to cut the overhead costs for grants from the NIH and the National Science Foundation, sort of across the board. So that's on top of sort of the individual studies that have been canceled.
Yeah, until I read your story, I hadn't seen a tally of how many grants for public health and scientific research have been canceled here in Rhode Island since Donald Trump became president again. How many did you find?
Yeah, and the reason you hadn't seen a tally is because Brown University had not released one until now, and they are still declining to release the full list of grants that have been cut. We have some sense from the Trump administration, but because they come from all different agencies, it's been difficult to get a solid tally. Brown told me that they have had 36 grants cut so far. The University of Rhode Island has had about 20. And I will say that the numbers keep going up. So each time I got a number from them, they would call back a few days later and say, okay, we had a couple more grants cut.
So they're still finding out, and
Yes.
This number's going to grow.
Yeah, and the Department of Health had 4 grants cut. So in total, I believe it was up to 63 at last check. But again, that number is constantly changing and is going to potentially keep going up. No one knows really when it's going to stop.
And can you explain why this is a particularly bad time for the Trump administration to be slashing funding for scientific research?
Yeah, Rhode Island has been trying to create a life sciences sector. It's actually happening right here in the Jewelry District where you and I are sitting, Ed. And the goal is to have, medical innovations happening here, to lure companies to Rhode Island who are going to take this scientific research that's happening at Brown and URI and turn it into actual products and therapies that people can use.
So your story began by telling us that Dr. Amy Nunn almost fell out of bed. Why did she almost fall out of bed?
Yeah, she was so shocked in 2019 when she was listening to President Trump's State of the Union address.
My budget will ask Democrats and Republicans to make the needed commitment to eliminate the HIV epidemic in the United States within 10 years. We have made incredible strides, incredible.
And she was thrilled by that news at the time. But that is not what has happened in Trump's second term. He has cut a great deal of HIV research, including Amy Nunn's project that was just getting started here in Rhode Island.
Boston Globe columnist James Pindell just wrote a piece that I read this morning that says President Trump's return to power is defined less by disruption than by contradictions of his own making. So is this an example of contradicting a policy from his prior term with these cuts?
That's certainly what Dr. Nunn says.
He's basically undoing a lot of the progress from his first administration. Our trial responded to all of the priorities that he had laid out previously.
So what was the funding for the Rhode Island Public Health Institute going toward?
What they were doing at the Rhode Island Public Health Institute, and this was funded through the Brown University School of Public Health, was researching a protocol to keep Black and Latino men who have sex with men on PrEP, which is, if you haven't heard of it, a drug where if you're HIV negative, it is almost 100% effective in preventing you from contracting HIV if you are exposed. Dr. Nunn points out that the rates of HIV are much higher in Black and Latino men than in white men.
Black gay men have about a 1 in 2 lifetime chance of contracting HIV. That's higher than some HIV prevalence rates in sub-Saharan Africa, just to put it in context. For white men, it's 1 in 140.
And so they are trying to solve for that problem by creating a protocol involving these people called navigators who are going to essentially help the patient get on the drug and stay on the drug despite various barriers like cost and, stigma that exists in certain communities more than others. And they were in the process of enrolling 300 patients in Rhode Island, Mississippi, and Washington, D.C.
Oh, so not just Rhode Island. Yeah.
Correct. It wasn't just in Rhode Island. In fact, there's higher rates of HIV in the Deep South. They had already done a pre-trial, and they received the grant to actually do the full-scale trial. And it was $3.7 million, and it was just terminated.
Why did the administration say it is cutting that funding?
Well, they said it was because of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can infer that it's because it was focusing on Black and Latino men. Also, the fact that it's LGBTQ patients. The letter wasn't that specific. I've now seen many, many iterations of this same language in many different grants that have been cut. It says that DEI harms the health of Americans.
And so what does Dr. Nunn say in response to the idea that it was cut because of DEI?
Well, she disagrees.
This isn't just DEI. This is about saving the lives of people who are the sickest or who are the most likely to get sick. And now we're eradicating our commitments to those vulnerable people. And we have a moral issue with that.
She points out that focusing on the people who are most likely, in her words, to get sick and to get the disease makes the most sense.
We'll have more with Steph Machado after a quick break. When you want to go beyond the headlines, let me recommend Rhode Island PBS Weekly. Rhode Island PBS Weekly is an award-winning news magazine broadcast that gives you the full story, powered by investigative journalism and narrative storytelling. New episodes of Rhode Island PBS Weekly drop Sundays at 7:30 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS. Watch past episodes at ripbs.org/weekly. That's ripbs.org/weekly. So I saw you also spoke with Dr. Philip Chan, who runs a Providence Health Clinic with Dr. Nunn for LGBTQ plus patients called Open Door Health. What did he have to say?
He was really shocked. He talked about how rare it is for the NIH to cancel grants.
Well, you basically have to do something really wrong for that to happen. To just uniformly cancel all these grants based on political ideology or because they're enrolling transgender people is really never happened before.
Last year, Rhode Island's General Assembly budgeted $45 million for the Rhode Island Life Science Hub. Tell us about what that agency does and how it'll be affected by these cuts.
Well, none of the $45 million is in jeopardy because that all comes from the state. Right. So they don't have to worry about the federal cuts in that way. But what they're using that money for is to try to lure companies to come here and to write grants for innovation, medical innovation, to happen here in Rhode Island. And so one of the researchers I spoke to said, look, you can open a hub, but you need the brain power and the research that's coming out of, again, mostly Brown University and also URI. Now, Brown University is doing hundreds and hundreds of studies, so we are still talking about 36 grants being cut. It's a relatively small number of their total grants, but if the Trump administration manages to cut the overhead costs, they want to cut it down to 15%, that would affect all studies, and that could have a much wider impact, not to mention the mysterious $500 million that the Trump administration has said they will cut to the university. So the way that that would affect the Life Science Hub is that there wouldn't be all the research, right? And all the brain power and all the science that would need to back these biotech companies who are trying to create actual products.
You spoke to Dr. Mark Turco, the first CEO of the new Life Science Hub. What did he have to say about all this?
You know, he was still pretty optimistic. He obviously is really thrilled that the new state health lab, which is also going to have the incubator space for companies, is almost done being constructed. He said, you know, maybe there's an opportunity for philanthropic donations or private funding for scientific research. And perhaps we've been too reliant on the federal government to fund this type of research.
Some of these cuts actually, in my opinion, need to occur. We have spent a lot of money. You know, we need to show a lot of return for investment on some of these dollars.
So House Speaker Joe Shekarchi championed the Life Science Hub. What did he have to say about this?
Yeah, I mean, this was really his initiative. He really pushed for, made sure that it got all of this money. Listen, it is a tough budget year, as you know, Ed, because you cover the State House so closely. He is really thrilled about the Life Science Hub. He said, we will do anything to help them that they need as long as it doesn't involve money. He mentioned they could do some state-backed bonds of some sort, but they don't have money in the budget to give more to the Life Science Hub this year.
Yeah, tough financial year up at the State House. So meanwhile, we've got Brown University building a $400,300,000 square foot lab building right next to the incubator there on Richmond Street in Providence. Is that project going to be affected by these funding cuts?
It could be. And this is where, again, the NIH cuts to overhead, it's called indirect costs, comes into play. There is a lawsuit up in Boston. A federal judge has temporarily blocked these cuts, but these would be widespread cuts to the overhead administrative costs of research. So we're talking the lease, the utilities, you know, costs that are necessary to do the research but are not strictly related to the science. If the NIH manages to do those cuts as they have envisioned, Brown University says they may need to halt construction on this lab building that, just to put it into perspective, is supposed to house 700 researchers doing work from aging and immunity and cancer and bioengineering. They wrote in court documents that they may have to halt that project. So that would be a huge deal for this life sciences sector that's trying to be built here in the Jewelry District. That project is where a lot of the science discoveries would be found.
And that's a huge building. We see it every day. And it's not done yet.
No, that one just started.
Yeah.
That one just started.
Yeah.
So they could halt that and it would delay the work, right? It takes time to do science, to get grant funding, and to actually conduct studies. And so this is a long-term goal that will just potentially keep getting delayed.
So what did Brown University President Christina Paxson say about this?
She declined to be interviewed for the story. Her spokesperson said there was just too much uncertainty, again, with this $500 million that the Trump administration has threatened to cut from Brown but has not actually told them about yet. But the spokesman said they're really planning for all different scenarios. The building might not get built, the lab building, but also they're planning for if they need to make cuts to research, if they need to do widespread layoffs. And he mentioned there could be a ripple effect on the local economy. Brown purchases a great deal of goods and services locally to make their research happen. Now, he did say Brown will continue to be a research institution. As you know, it has the only medical school in the state and will continue to be rooted in research. But there's obviously a question about how that's all going to get funded. They have to be realistic about the different scenarios.
The National Institutes of Health director has spoken about these cuts, hasn't he?
Yeah, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya spoke at a 5-hour Zoom meeting with an advisory council that I watched a good chunk of, where, you know, doctors on this advisory council were asking him a number of questions. And he said, look, I think the president's DEI orders have been misunderstood.
I don't think that they're aimed at stopping fundamental research that advances the health and well-being of minority populations. I wouldn't have accepted this job if that was the case.
So he was seeking to sort of quell the concerns that are coming out of the scientific community about the Trump administration's priorities.
You also examined the impact of the cuts on the University of Rhode Island. Tell us about that.
Well, URI does a lot of research related to oceans. And I spoke to Professor Austin Becker, who's the chair of the Marine Affairs Department, who was doing research funded by the Department of Homeland Security into how hurricanes are going to affect Rhode Island's coast. And he was working with the Department of Emergency Management and the U.S. Coast Guard and multiple municipalities, the Port of Providence, essentially for this tool that would allow all of those different agencies to see how an impending hurricane is going to affect, let's say, an electrical transformer or some other infrastructure asset that you want to protect. And the Trump administration cut his research off on April 8th.
So I thought the administration was cutting anything that had to do with DEI or anything they see as quote unquote woke. What does that got to do with hurricane research? There's no liberal or conservative hurricanes.
Well, my initial question was, is it because it's tied to climate change? And Professor Becker said he doesn't think so because the Trump administration actually cut all of the research grants under what were called the Centers of Excellence at the Department of Homeland Security. This is basically multiple different centers at different universities that were doing research for Homeland Security, and they all got cut on the same day, and the other ones had nothing to do with climate science.
I don't think anybody looked at the individual projects.
He also argues, yes, this has a little bit to do with climate change, but he's looking at hurricanes happening now. The goal was to be able to track hurricanes in real time. So this is not about some mystery future climate change. This was about weather that we are having now. We are having flooding impacts now.
So what can be done about all these cuts? Did anyone you spoke to offer a potential solution?
Well, I think the courts are a potential solution here. Dr. Ashish Jha, who's the dean of the School of Public Health at Brown University, spoke at a Globe event recently.
I'm going to see how a lot of what's going on in the courts play out. I want to see what Congress does this fall with the new budget. It does create a ton of uncertainty, and that will have lasting impact.
And he mentioned that he's worried about young scientists not going into this field because of the uncertainty of getting their work funded.
There are people who are graduating right now who would have stayed in a job here who might head off to Europe or to China or to India and work. And those will have long-term consequences. So I think this story is hardly written, but even already we're starting to see some long-term damage, and I am hopeful that we will be able to stave off a lot more long-term damage.
And Dr. Nunn said she really hopes that Republicans get more outraged about this.
I think this is an attack on science and truth, and it's ultimately a way to control messaging. That is terrifying because the nation's top universities are under assault because of their commitment to finding the truth and finding answers. And I think that we might be in the middle of a cultural revolution in which that's no longer valued.
What will we be keeping an eye on going forward regarding scientific research funding here in Rhode Island?
Well, I think the types of studies that are being cut will continue to be interesting because they keep trickling in and they seem to have a lot to do with race, LGBTQ, climate science. They're really running on this ideological line. What will happen with this $500 million that the Trump administration says they're going to cut to Brown, that we still have not received sort of official word of that. That's, by the way, double what Brown gets in federal funding per year. So is it over 2 years? Is it over 3 years? Like, what is this? What is that cut and what does it look like? And then the third thing is the court cases. Will judges stop these cuts from happening?
Steph Machado, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Ed.
Rhode Island Report is a production of the Boston Globe in collaboration with Rhode Island PBS. Today's episode was produced by Megan Hall. Audio mixing and mastering by Marissa Ewing of Hemlock Creek Productions. Our music is from APM. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. See you next week. Looking to binge watch all your favorite PBS shows? You need Rhode Island PBS Passport. Masterpiece, Antiques Roadshow, Rhode Island PBS Weekly, and many more. Watch them all, anytime, and from any streaming device. Learn more about this member benefit at ripbs.org/passport. That's ripbs.org/passport.